Welcome to this edition of Security and Compliance Weekly. Today we're joined by one of our own, none other than Ben Carr, who is co-host of Business Security Weekly. I asked Ben to join us today to have a conversation around the role of the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, or CISO, or CISO, or CISO, if you want to be safe, for a couple of reasons. One, because he is one. Two, because I listened to a recent episode of Business Security Weekly, which is, I think it was 424, if anybody's interested, where Ben was providing a CISO's perspective on all sorts of topics related to cybersecurity. And I thought that this would be good to have him come in and sort of give the security versus compliance spin on everything he was saying about the role of a CISO. Also, because a couple months ago, I had an experience where I met a couple cybersecurity college students, young professionals who were whose life's goals were to someday become a CISO. That was their life's career goal, and I thought that seems kind of weird, given that CISOs are usually the butt of the jokes within the security community, and otherwise expected to be the scapegoats, first ones fired, in terms of major breaches, and so on and so forth. Hopefully, Ben will set us straight on all these things as we continue our journey of tearing down silos and building bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
Okay, welcome to episode 98 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on December 14th, 2021. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann. Joining me today are Ms. Kat Valentine and Ms. Joe Baum. Flea actually couldn't join us today because he had a last-minute meeting, I think, with his CISO. So, ironically enough, welcome, ladies, if I'm allowed to call you ladies, to the show. A couple announcements before we get going. Throughout 2022, the Cyber Risk Alliance's Business Intelligence Unit will be releasing research reports on the top topics across the security industry. The first report will be on third-party risk in the supply chain. To participate in the survey, which I assume has something to do with the reporting, please visit securityweekly.com/third-party risk. The results will be shared at our third-party risk e-summit coming up in January. Also, when you're online at our website, don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings. We have quite a burgeoning portfolio of material there. You can find it at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Anyway, how weird is it, Ben? You're a host of a show, and now you're the guest of a show. Welcome, Ben, to Security and Compliance Weekly.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here. Good to be on another show within the kind of domain. So, yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk all things security and compliance with you.
Is this your first crossover episode within our little fiefdom here?
Yeah, I guess in a way, right? Like you mentioned that a couple 2 weeks ago, we on Business Security Weekly, I did a talk with Matt, kind of on the role of the CISO. So, in essence, that's a I was fulfilling two roles, but this is my first show crossover. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you for agreeing to be here today. I actually met Ben a couple years ago. We both worked for a minute at a little company called Tenable. I'm sure they're not busy the last couple days. And I was intrigued to meet Ben because I was there at Tenable as the PCI subject matter expert. And Ben, if I recall correctly, you came to Tenable straight from a role at Visa, some
Yeah,
small credit
another
card company, right?
small company that people may or may not have heard of. Yeah, I worked
Right.
for Visa for about 4 years and ran their attack surface management program globally. So yeah.
Well, not to steal your thunder, and while we're on the topic, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got to be where you are today, which is a CISO.
And so I started out early in my career, kind of in the IT side of the house. Really got interested in security when I worked for McAfee at the time. I had been hired to kind of work with their help desk product, and a little bit on the AV side, and really started getting interested in their security line of products. Right, obviously they had PGP, they had a firewall product, they had several other things. Right, and that really got me focused on it, and worked for a number of startups, and then took a role for another small company people may have heard of called Nokia. And so went over back to the internal side of security and started. I ran their program, was head of global IT security for about 4 years. Went to Visa subsequently, ran the attack surface management program there. And Visa has a large program, right, as many financials do. And then took a role with Tenable, then went over and became a CISO for Aristocrat, which is in the gaming space. They do about 60% of their business was kind of in the casino gaming space, and the other 40% was in casual digital gaming. So did that for 2 years, built their program from the ground up. Went over to Qualys and ran their security program as their CISO for about the last 18 months. And then just recently moved over. I'm now the CISO for Cradlepoint, which is part of Ericsson. So I've had a couple different roles in the CISO arena, varied experience. It hasn't all been in one vertical, which is nice. And really kind of given me some different perspective on stuff. So even, Nokia being really internationally focused, Aristocrat was out of Australia. So just kind of a diversity of thought and exposure that's nice from a CISO perspective to kind of apply that in a lot of different situations.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. And mental note to myself, I want to come back to that, just the experiences of being a CISO within different verticals. But before we get to that, we do have a question that we ask all of our guests, and I want to get that out of the way early. What we like to call the hot seat question, since our show is focused not only on security but compliance and the convergence divergence of the two, which we're continuously exploring from episode to episode. What is your take, simply put, on, or what is your perspective on the whole security versus compliance continuum question?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, especially from a CISO. And I think some of it depends upon, again, your background, what companies you've been associated with, how you see the intersection of security and compliance, which I guess is the core of your question. For me, I like to really think about it in a way that says, compliance and regulatory issues really arose from the fact that people weren't doing things that they should be doing. And if we were all doing things perfectly, we wouldn't have had a need for compliance or regulation. And so I like to approach it from the fact that we should run a program in a way that we're actually doing the best things for the business. And as a result of that, we should get to 95% of the compliance stuff, right? There's probably some outliers and stuff we may not agree on, but we have to do for a compliance reason. So in a way, it's a necessary evil to a lot of people. I just like to think that it's an indicator for doing the right things, that the compliance side should be easy. And I think it sometimes, as a CISO, gives us a reason to push the business to get things done, right? When they would say, if we didn't have that compliance or regulatory guideline, maybe we wouldn't want to go that way, right? So it's really interesting, and we can dive into this if you want, but I have worked for companies that are highly regulated. And I've worked for companies that thought they were highly regulated. But when in a gaming space, when you say highly regulated, you mean Nevada Gaming Commission, right? Which really doesn't have a lot to do with information security controls. And so, in a highly regulated organization that from an IS side isn't highly regulated, it's really difficult to get some stuff done. So compliance can really be a positive factor if you're running a program correctly. So super long answer there, Jeff. I don't know if you were looking for something as long-winded, but Yeah, that's my
Well,
thought.
no, we don't have a time limit on the answer to the hot seat question. We ask it because we're trying to get a little bit of understanding of where our guests are coming from. So we don't intend to take sides or pick apart your stance necessarily. We just want to know where you're coming from.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because I was curious to hear your response to the hot seat question, because you did work for Visa for a couple of years, and Visa is largely responsible for arguably what has been the biggest, longest lasting, most prolific compliance standard out there, a little thing called, and get your drinks ready, everybody, PCI. I'm being festive today, by the way. I'm drinking eggnog, and I'll leave it to your imagination whether it's spiked or not. So as I started thinking about, okay, I want to talk about the role of CISO, and I hear all these mixed messages if I'm being objective and stepping back and listening
Yeah.
to what people say about the CISO, and certainly have heard my share of CISO jokes, and CISO is the butt of the joke, and I guess I've known a few CISOs that have gotten fired along the way,
It happens.
but also trying to, but trying to think about. Having been in the industry a long time, coming out into the private sector 25 years ago, and I did look up some of the old slide decks that we used to use back in my early days of commercial consulting, where we were largely trying to sell the concept of a security program and how a security program needed to be built around a security policy, and we didn't really get into roles and titles and things like that. So one of my first questions, and I mentioned it to you on our prep call, was where did the idea of a CISO come from? What's the origin story? And it turns out I Googled it, and it actually has a very specific origin. And I'll get the link and post it up on the Discord. But apparently, and correct me if I'm wrong, but because I only clicked on the first thing I found on the Google, the first CISO was hired by Citicorp, or the role was created by Citicorp back in like 1994, 1995. And the very first CISO was a gentleman named Steve Katz,
Right.
who was hired by Citicorp because Citicorp had a breach, and they needed to bring somebody fresh in. And I was reading an article about his backstory, and he said, one of his biggest chagrins or misgivings about taking the position was he found out that they were going to make a public announcement about the breach a month after he came on board. So Steve Katz was not only the first CISO, but he was also officially the first CISO to be thrown under the bus, which I found interesting. Did I get it right? Did I Google search correctly? Is that the origin story you understand of where the term CISO came about?
Yeah, that is the origin story, and I think that's 95, right? Like the first CISO. That it seems in one hand late, and in another hand very early in the process, right? Having it's now 2021, and I guess dating myself, that's in 94, 95. That's when I graduated college. So the career didn't exist per se when I graduated college. And that's, I think, one of the challenges is a lot of people who have the title now. And I like to define just the CISO as the top security executive in the role that's responsible for security across the organization. Many of the people came out of like a very technical track. And we talk about this a lot on Business Security Weekly. Jason and I talk about it quite frequently. I've actually given some talks on it over the last year, kind of the evolution of the role. And I was intrigued when you asked me to come talk. It's just interesting to think about how it's evolved and where it is now. And I think where it is now is very different from where it started, as really looking for someone out of typically the CIO's organization, who had a technical background, who understood the technical controls to apply technical implementations, right, and figure out how to secure the organization. And at the time, I don't think it was really an executive position. It was just giving someone a C-level title, a chief title. But now I think that the trend is really that it's shifted, and corporations are looking for a business level executive, typically probably somebody who has some type of information security technical background, to lead that area of the organization. But what the business actually needs or wants is a business level executive, not a technical person. And so it's shifting. I think foundationally, many people still report to the CIO, but it's really a horrible reporting structure and not one that's well suited to where businesses are looking to go now. And I think that's why the role is in so much flux.
Well, it's funny you bring up the idea of the reporting structure, because that is something I do remember from, again, the early days of my commercial private sector consulting career, where we were arguing where the person who was going to be responsible for information security, we didn't call it cybersecurity back then, where they would fall, or where was it appropriate to fall that role within an organization. And I can remember having very long philosophical arguments, discussions with people about whether the person in charge should be under the CIO, or maybe under the CFO, or even, they're somewhat new even back then, even under perhaps the CTO, or whether they should be sort of a line item, dotted line, reporting right into the CEO. So I'm guessing that 25 years later, while it's common that this role falls under CIO, you seem to imply that's probably not the best place for it most of the time. Where do you think? Actually, let me back up. First, let's define what it is in modern terms. Define what is a CISO in modern terms for this week or this day or this hour anyway, and then let's talk about where it should be in an organization. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So the CISO, like, as I said, I think if I really think about that CISO role and what it means, it's the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. And I usually define that as the senior executive who's responsible for information security across the organization. Now, the challenge becomes there's really a lot to unpack here. Is that, initially when you asked about, and I mentioned the fact that I think reporting to the CIO is difficult and challenging, is by its nature, it's a conflict of interest, right? So that's kind of the first thing, is that typically the issues that you're finding or you're highlighting as risks to the organization, you're putting on the risk register and you're saying, hey, we need to fix this. We need to devote resources or money to correct this issue, or for a compliance reason. Those typically are in that or have been from a legacy perspective in the information organization, right? And it's under the CIO's purview. And so since that CIO is sitting there and you're saying, hey, these things that are under my boss's purview are problems, it naturally breeds a conflict of interest, right? And so even though that's the most common reporting structure, it's been the one that's fraught with the most potential problems. That's not to say it can't work out well. I've reported to CIOs before and, we've had a good relationship. But I think ultimately from an evolution standpoint, this role is being seen as more of a business critical role and elevated out of just a technical role. And so I think, one, it calls into question reporting structure. We're seeing a lot of more forward-thinking companies have it report to a chief operating officer, the CEO, or the board directly. I've seen even smaller companies where it's a direct board report. So that's a really interesting structure, and it speaks to the need to have independence there, right? And to have authority in the hands of the CISO to correct issues. The second thing that breeds is the CISO really the right title? I mean, from a legacy perspective, I think that Chief Information Security Officer was probably correct. But if you think of a lot of things now and where that lies, when you think of a DevSecOps world and how the CISO may actually have responsibility over that area, if he really truly has security over the whole org, that's not aligned under the CIO. That's usually under product or engineering, R&D, right? And so if that's the case, then is information security, is it really more of a chief security officer? In the past, that aligned a lot to somebody who did physical security, but I think physical security in forward-thinking companies who have evolved rolls up under that what we used to call the CISO. But I'm hearing chief security officer, chief trust officer, with the integration of privacy, a lot of privacy issues and privacy kind of being split between legal and the CISO's role. And those two roles, either chief security officer, chief trust officer, or potentially even falling up in some very large organizations like a chief risk officer, that's kind of where I see this evolving too. I've even heard of some orgs where they flip the script and the CIO is actually reporting up into the CISO. Doesn't happen very often, but I've heard of it. And that speaks to the importance of security to the business versus just a functional tech role where, hey, just make sure we're secure, stay in the closet, and we don't want to see you unless there's a problem. I think foundationally, you really have to have an understanding of the whole business to really be functional and offer business level value. So.
Okay. I don't want to bogart the microphone. Kat, Joe, jump in. Do you have questions, comments? Somebody.
Sorry, I'll jump in. I think the size of the organization and the importance they place on each of these roles sometimes plays an impact too. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know not just from smaller or mid-size, but we can, as experts or advisors or consultants, however you want to place that role, for us kind of looking into an organization, depending on where that role sits, you can kind of see the priority that the organization has put on it. Or even on the website, if they're actually identifying these people as a part of their executive leadership or not identifying them, it also kind of sends a message about, the criticality and the importance and the investment they're making in it. Do you want to talk a little bit, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, 100%. So I think that's really a good observation. Again, one of the talk tracks that I've been talking with, and again, Jason and I over on BSW talk about this quite frequently, is as this role is evolving and the change is happening, like CISOs need to think about what their interest lies and what type of CISO there are, because there are different personas within the CISO the CISOs out there, my colleagues, and we can talk to that too. But matching that up with the company and what they're looking for in a CISO, and sometimes it's most interesting to find out what's the reporting structure. So when I was being approached by companies, and as I mentioned, I just transitioned to Cradlepoint. That's one of my first questions: is where does the CISO role report? And if it was reporting to the CIO, it told me a lot about the organization and the maturity level, right? And if it didn't, then that told me a different story. Also, as you mentioned, like, what's the public presence of this? Where do they see the role? Is the CISO role, even though it's a chief, right? Same as the CFO, chief legal, chief sales officer, even though it's a chief, like, is it seen actually as part of the executive staff? Do you sit on the E staff, or do you sit at a lower level? So, from a public side, I think there were some companies last year that had some major incidents, right? In the vendor land. And those vendors, if you went to their site and looked, like, did they list a CISO there? They were conspicuously absent from the leadership page. And I think that told a huge story. And so I think all of us, whether you're looking for a role or whether you're engaging with a company as a vendor or a supplier, need to really look at how seriously they take the role and what's the maturity they have. And part of that is, where does that role sit? Do they even have one? It's actually surprising the number of companies that still don't have CISOs. I mean, there are Fortune 500 companies that don't have CISOs, and that boggles my mind every day. Where it sits, what is their responsibility? And then, are they pushing them forward as part of their executive leadership team? And do they see that as a competitive advantage? Are they actually using security as a differentiator? And that's something I look for with every one of my vendors. In fact, it's very hard for me to do business as a CISO with a vendor that doesn't have a CISO in that spot, because in a breach or an incident, I need to know that they're taking things seriously.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I would say that in a past life in the audit role, usually at the end of any kind of audit, although this happened a lot more so for SOC 2 audits, you have like a little debrief meeting where maybe you didn't ding them for a thing, but they could stand for some improvement in some area, right? And hello, dog. Sorry. One of the things, she's just climbing around everywhere. She started distracting as soon as I got on, so that's big fun. One of the things that we would do is have these debrief meetings, and I feel glad. I'm glad that you're bringing this kind of stuff up, because one of the things as the auditor that I would try to tell a CEO and the CTO and things like that, if I didn't see that CISO role there, is I'd let them know how that does look to business partners, vendors, like your own customers, you know what I mean, and auditors. And I think that, so I figured that was worth kind of shimming in there for other auditors that are out there. You might want to include that kind of caveat in the debrief, hey, you can improve with this because you're sending this message and maybe you don't know you're sending this message.
Yeah, I think that's really true. There was a recent report by Audit and Struggles that kind of outlined where the reporting structures were, right? And if you look at that, 38% of CISOs report up to the CIO, right? 16% to the CTO, only 11% to the CEO. And that's a problem. That's a change that needs to happen. I mean, but if you're not even listing that you have a CISO, that's just a huge issue. I mean, I can't believe the number of people that don't, but it's really eye-opening when you see that, and then you see the people that actually end up having issues in the marketplace. From a traditional CISO perspective, if you look at it and you think about that, there was another study that came out that said only 61% of all organizations have a CISO, but that number increases to 80% for large enterprises. But my question is, like, in large enterprises, 20% don't have a CISO, don't have a top level exec who's responsible for security, like that. And you think about that as a consumer, whether it's dealing with, a retail transaction or your insurance, banking, healthcare, that's problematic.
Yeah, I wanted to, you sort of halfway touched on what I wanted you to expound upon is, when these surveys say that there is no role of CISO, does that mean that there is nobody that, like you said, is executive level in charge of security, or they have that, it just goes by another name, or it falls under another role, perhaps? My more generic question before you dipped into this was going to be, and I think it blends here. Because CISO is the butt of so many jokes in the hacker and security world, and people kind of look down there, and I'm being generic, of course, overgeneralizing. People look down their noses at the role of CISO, or when you meet somebody that's a CISO, you're like, well, what are you going to be doing 6 months from now? Or what's your strategy for your career goals and stuff like that. But what is the perception, I guess, of who's doing security if there's not a CISO by title, I guess, within an organization? And or for all those security professionals out there that like to think that CISOs are the butt of the joke and the laughing stock of organizations, clearly they're implying that they're not really doing the job that they should be doing. Who is, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, Prussian question. So, look, if I look at it and I think about organizations that may not have a CISO or a top line executive that's responsible for security, most organizations probably have somebody who's a VP or director level who reports up to the CIO, or reports to some other part of the org. Maybe it's split, right? Maybe there's people in product who have some security background and knowledge. Maybe there's some people in IT that are responsible for corporate IT systems, but there's not an overall strategy and approach to security as a driver for the business. And so when you think of it that way, that really leads you to believe that if there's not a strategy and approach for how you're doing security, then there are things you're missing. There are things you're not doing right. You may have a really good DevOps program, but you may have a real big deficiency on the corporate side that still leads to a breach. You may, be doing things well from a risk and compliance side, but you're only doing it for risk and compliance. So there's a bunch of things, best practice stuff that you're just missing because it's not specifically called out in a guideline, or security moves on and it takes a while, as I'm sure with PCI and the evolution of it takes a while for things to catch up. And there's still things in PCI that, from my perspective, if you're not doing things 100% correct, that it still leave you gaps or aren't worth doing because you're not getting the full value. And one of the things I often talk about is file integrity management. If you're, you're required to do file integrity management, but if you're not actually matching that with change control to figure out is the change required or not, then typically a lot of that just becomes noise and people don't monitor it really well, right? So you could be doing the control, but you're doing the control just to do the control. You're not actually doing it for the intended purpose and the right output. And so when I think about that, and I think about companies that don't have that role, they probably do have somebody that's doing some security somewhere in the org, very different levels of how well they're doing it. But the problem is they don't have a business level strategy, and they haven't. It's an indication and a public admittance that they don't understand the importance. And if they don't understand the importance today, when there was another study that came out, you get all these statistics and studies, right? It said, cyber or information security issues were on the minds as a top level risk for 88% of public companies. Well, if 88% of public companies, that's one of their top level, if not the top level risk at a board level, but they haven't invested in a security organization and a security executive responsible for it, that's, again, really, really concerning, right? I mean, I think you have a fiduciary responsibility to address, whatever your top level risk is from a business perspective, both for customers, for investors. It's just, supplier. It's just really, really important. And that's the miss. And I think that's what we're getting to. And if you look back, from a financial perspective, there was a time when you didn't have to have someone with financial expertise on the board that could actually read the balance sheet. That changed, and we had regulation that came in that said, you need to do that. If you don't do that, you can't be a public company. It's going to cause huge issues. And I would have liked to think we would have moved past the need for regulation on these things, but I'm at the point where I feel like we need some regulation saying, if you're going to be a publicly listed, publicly traded company, if you're going to be critical infrastructure, like you have to have a CISO, they have to have independent responsibility and authority. And you've got to have the org built to do that, the right thing.
So immediate thought was that Enron or Halliburton that led to the need for financial acuity on the board level positions. You're also trying to pick a PCI fight. I have to very quickly
I'm not picking it. I like PCI. I just think it was identity compliance.
No, you threw down, and I need to respond to it. And what you're saying is largely somewhat fair. The file integrity requirement, the requirements that exist in PCI are found in requirement 10, whereas the change control, change management type of stuff, which is in there, but it's in requirement 6. So it would be very easy if a company, an organization is prone to be going, treating it as a checklist, just kind of going down the line, not making those larger
that was my point
of connectivity.
It's the maturity, and you look, everybody's on a maturity journey, right? And I most of the organizations I started off in haven't been in a high maturity from the information security side, so there's a lot of things that can be improved, right? I think on the compliance side, a lot of people see them as disconnected, but in reality, like, the whole intent is that you're putting it all together in a holistic package. To your point, like, you should be connecting change control with file integrity. But if you don't, like, it doesn't provide a lot of value. And I think that's where the check the box compliance driven side of the house. And for many organizations that don't have a CISO and aren't seeing it strategically, they're just trying to check the box to get by the regulations, right? I don't think that's really the intent. Shouldn't be the intent.
It's not, and hey, maybe organizations need to have something like a CISO that is, at least if nothing else, able to take a step back and take a more holistic look at whatever regulatory compliance standards or whatever else there is that motivates them to do anything from a security, cybersecurity, information, data security perspective. Let's take okay. Make a quick point, then we'll take a break. Go ahead.
I was say just one quick point. So just to go back, not on the PCI platform, but so we just, right. So just one quick comment about what you were just saying about, identifying it at executive level, the priority and the importance of that CISO role, or, take the CISO out of it, the organization saying, hey, yes, this is our biggest risk. I think the translation between, yes, this is my biggest, most critical risk, and what am I supposed to do about that? I don't think a lot, outside of our space, this is now 4 of us here who know the importance, the criticality, the tactical, the strategic, what needs to happen. You've probably got the rest of that executive team who says, yeah, that should definitely be one of my most critical risks, and it definitely has a financial impact. I don't really know what to do about that, how I should invest in it, what I should do to change anything. I should probably consider hiring one of those guys. What are they called? Oh, yeah, the CISO. I think translating that action is, and understanding what to do is a huge gap. I think even for those you're talking about, Fortune 50, 100, 200 organization. So I don't know if you want me to leave it there for the second half, but I wanted to make that go back to that quick comment.
Okay, thank you,
Jeff,
Joe.
I can respond, or we can come in after the break.
Yeah, let's take a quick break, and I will let you respond, and then we will take up the conversation again. So we'll be right back.